Let me ask you something simple. When do protectors begin to look like occupiers? When does the line blur between guarding peace and flexing power? When does a shield become a shadow that covers more than it shelters? Because wherever you stand politically or ideologically, this is the truth. The United States has over 750 military bases spread out across more than 80 countries and territories, and that is not a defensive position anymore, that is a global presence. And with that kind of reach come serious questions. We have told ourselves for decades that these bases are necessary, that they keep the world stable and our homeland safe, that they serve as deterrents to enemies, as guardians of freedom, as symbols of strength, and maybe in some ways they have done that, but if we are going to have an honest conversation, we better be willing to look at the whole picture, not just what we want it to be, but also what it is becoming, because here is the uncomfortable thing. About power, the more of it you display, the more of it people assume you are willing to use. And when you place hundreds upon hundreds of military installations all over the world, no matter how noble your intentions might be, there will be plenty who look at that and do not see protection. They see preparation, they see dominance, they see control, and eventually those perceptions start to shape reality. This is not just about tanks, planes, or boots on the ground. It is about trust. It is about how we are seen. It is about how our presence is interpreted by ordinary people on foreign soil who wake up every day under the shadow of a foreign flag flying next to theirs. We like to say we bring stability, but stability for who, and at what cost? And if increasing numbers of people in host nations are starting to question our motives, should we not be asking those same questions ourselves? I am not saying pull all the troops out overnight. I am not preaching isolation or weakness. What I am saying is that maybe what started as a necessary measure has over time become a default posture, and now that posture walks a fine line between reassurance and intimidation. What started as a footprint has become a footprint so large that it leaves little room for others to stand freely beside us. Are we engaging these regions as partners, or are we just making them permanent address labels for our own use? We say we safeguard our interests, but do we really mean we want to control the outcome? And if so, how different are we from the very empires we once rose up against, the ones who conquered under the banner of order but stayed long after the battle ended, not because of danger but because of convenience and gain? The truth is every one of those bases has a story. Some were born from war, others from diplomacy, some from fear, some from strategy, but not all of those stories are still relevant, and some of them have turned into something else entirely, permanent fixtures that no longer reflect the present but continue to cost us anyway, not just in dollars but in credibility, in relationships, and in the image we project to the world. Do you know what happens when your house is filled with locked security cameras, fences, guards, alarms? You might feel secure for a while, but sooner or later the question changes from why do you need so much protection to what are you afraid of, or worse, what are you hiding? The same thing applies to nations. When our global presence becomes this widespread and this entrenched, people stop seeing safety and start seeing something else entirely. The thing about dominance is it breeds dependency, and dependency is not the same as stability. When we station our forces everywhere, we become responsible for every crisis, every conflict, every disagreement, and slowly over time the world starts looking to us, not just for help, but for permission. And that is not leadership, that is control, and control in the hands of any one power, no matter how well intention, never ends the way we want it to. If we are honest, we have to admit that some of these bases are not about protecting lives anymore. They are about protecting position, about maintaining reach, about signaling strength to allies and enemies alike, even if that signal starts to sound like a warning siren instead of a welcome call. And if the world sees us as a nation that answers every Tension with a military footprint, then do not be surprised when the world begins to push back, not just diplomatically, but aggressively. Presence is not always peace and power, is not always protection. Sometimes it is just pressure disguised as security and right. Now we need to ask ourselves whether our worldwide network of bases is helping us stand with the world or stand on top of it. And the answer to that question is going to shape the next generation of global order and the legacy we leave behind, because a nation that stretches too far risks losing its balance, and sooner or later, weight of its own reach begins to pull it down. Let us talk about something we do not like to admit, even when we say our intentions are peaceful, even when we claim defense and deterrence as our reason for being there. The truth is not everybody sees it that way. What we call strength, some call provocation. What we call security, others call a threat. And the sooner we understand that perception shapes reaction, the better off we will be when we place our military bases just outside the borders of our biggest geopolitical rivals. We may see them as guard posts to prevent escalation, but those same nations often see them as encirclement and pressure tactics, and that is where things start to get dangerous, because deterrence only works if both sides agree on what the line looks like. If one side sees a shield and the other sees a sword, it is only a matter of time before a confrontation happens that nobody wanted in the first place. Think of it like this: imagine someone standing outside your house every day, not doing anything, just standing, just watching. Maybe they are smiling, maybe they are dressed nice, maybe they say they are just there in case something goes wrong. You might understand the reason, you might even believe for a while that they are there to help, but the longer they stay, the more you start to wonder why, and eventually your sense of safety starts to feel more like surveillance. Now stretch that example across oceans, across cultures, and across decades, and you start to understand what our bases might look like to the countries where we keep them. We say we are there to prevent war, but how often does our very presence raise tensions instead of reducing them? We say we are protecting allies, but sometimes our bases have the opposite effect, drawing more attention and hostility to the regions we claim to be safeguarding. In some cases, our presence creates the very danger we are supposed to be guarding against. And that is not defense, that is contradiction. The United States has long been seen as a global power, and with that power comes responsibility, but responsibility does not mean reacting to every threat with more troops, more ships, more hardware, because every time we do that we send another message, even when we do not mean to. We are saying that our strength comes from force, that we do not trust diplomacy, that our first instinct is pressure, not peacemaking, and sooner or later the world starts to believe it. You can only rely on military presence for so long before it begins to replace genuine relationships with fear-based arrangements, and relationships built on fear do not last. When a country cooperates with us only because we have fighters and bombers stationed nearby, that is not alliance, that is leverage, and leverage does not win hearts, it only buys temporary silence and deepens resentment under the surface. Think about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and how the United States reacted when a rival power placed weapons just 90 miles off our shore. We called it existential, we called it unacceptable. We stood on the brink of nuclear war because we felt encircled and violated. Now look at it from the other side. How do you think it feels when our bases sit just a few hundred miles from the borders of other nations year after year, not as a guest during a moment of crisis, but as a permanent fixture that never leaves? It is not hard to see why countries like Russia, China, Iran, and others view our military posture as something to counter, not to join. They see a pattern, not a partnership, and that pattern says we will move where we want, stay as long as we like, and respond how we choose regardless of what sovereign nations feel about it. And when people feel cornered, even powerful ones, their natural Instinct is not peace, it is resistance, and here is where it gets even more serious because continued provocation, intentional or not, leads to a new kind of arms race, not the old Cold War variety with missiles lined up across Europe, but a more fragile and unpredictable world where cyber war, proxy battles, and regional alliances pit nations against each other in guerrilla ways that are hard to contain and even harder to stop once they begin, and all of that feeds back into the original problem, creating more reason for more bases, further justifying the cycle if we keep mistaking deterrence for dominance. We will miss the warning signs. I am talking about a world on edge where no one backs down because everyone feels surrounded, a world where our effort to prevent conflict is actually laying the groundwork for one, especially as other nations rise and begin to challenge the idea that America is the only force allowed to define global order. What we need to recognize is this: sometimes our presence escalates the very situations we are trying to de-escalate. Our bases can bring us closer to war, not farther from it, not because we want war, but because we are building strategies around fear instead of mutual respect, and over time, fear backed by force becomes a strategy that no longer serves the people or the principles we claim to protect, because even the strongest fortress can become a target if it is placed on the wrong soil. Whenever we talk about our military bases around the world, we tend to focus on how they serve us, how they keep us safe, protect our interests, defend our values, and give us reach and readiness. But what we rarely stop to ask is how they affect the people who live around them, because for every base we operate abroad, there is a neighborhood, a town, a city full of people who may or may not want us there, and that matters more than we care to admit. We talk a lot about allies and partnerships, but real partnership means listening and being welcome, not just being tolerated. And the plain truth is, in many places around the world, our presence is no longer being welcomed the way it once was. We have gone from liberators to landlords, and from partners to permanent residents, showing no signs of packing up, and people notice that they feel it, and over time what was once support turns into resentment. You can't see it if you look closely. Protests that do not make it to our nightly news, voices on the ground, pushing back against our footprint, from Okinawa to Ramstein, from Diego Garcia to Djibouti. Locals speaking out about the toll our bases take, and I am not just talking about ideological opposition. I am talking about real everyday problems, things that deeply affect the lives of the people living near these bases: environmental damage, noise pollution, restricted access to areas that once belonged to them, rising tension between local populations and military personnel, even incidents of violence and exploitation. In Okinawa, Japan, for example, the island hosts more than half of all the U.S. troops stationed in the country, and many residents have grown weary of it. They live with the sound of jets overhead day and night. They live with the consequences of decades of accidents, misconduct, and a sense that their concerns are treated as secondary. They have said it loud and clear, and not just once, not just during election cycles, but consistently for years. What they want is not conflict. They want dignity. They want to be heard. And the same thing is happening elsewhere. In South Korea, locals in areas near U.S. bases have raised their voices too, over land use, over noise, over the cultural friction that comes from having a foreign military presence embedded in their communities. And you would think that as allies we would take a moment to ask whether our presence is still strengthening the relationship, or whether it is slowly straining it. These bases were never supposed to be permanent, and yet here we are in places we entered decades ago, still deeply embedded and often reluctant to leave or reduce our footprint. And even worse, we seem surprised when that starts to cause friction, as if the passage of time should soften the concerns of others rather than sharpen them. We often justify our global presence by saying we are there to help to protect values and freedoms, but how do we square that with the reality that some of the people we are supposed to be serving feel more occupied than supported? It is hard to build trust when your neighbor has a fence around your property and keeps guards posted 24/7, even if they say they are there to protect you. We have to see that forcing security onto others without their full consent or participation creates more risk than safety, more division than unity. We highlight the benefits of our bases like economic boosts and jobs. And for some, yes, that might be true, but benefits do not erase burdens, and no amount of money can compensate for lost autonomy or cultural friction that never goes away when cooperation turns into dependence and presence, turns into pressure. Even the friendliest nations start to question the terms of the relationship and what we think of as generosity or aid. They may begin to see as control and oversight. And when that tipping point arrives, working with the United States no longer feels like partnership, but like compliance, and that kind of dynamic does not foster peace. It breeds silent resistance and slow unraveling. We cannot keep telling ourselves that frustration overseas is just propaganda or fringe uprisings driven by a few radicals, when it is often mothers and fathers, teachers and workers, students and elders, people whose lives are directly impacted by military logistics and decisions made thousands of miles away without their voice or vote. And if we believe in democracy and sovereignty, then we should believe in it not only for ourselves, but for every nation we set foot in. Building peace is harder than building bases. Maintaining trust is harder than maintaining troops. And if we want to be known as a nation that values both, then we better start acting like it. Because every place we are not wanted becomes a place of risk, not just strategically, but morally, and no mission, no alliance, no objective is worth stepping over the people we claim to protect, because presence without respect eventually becomes a problem. No matter how noble the mission once was, there comes a moment in every great nation when it has to stop and look in the mirror and ask itself not just what am I doing, but why am I doing it? And that question right there, that why, goes deeper than strategy, deeper than foreign policy, deeper than military planning. It touches on who we are and what we actually believe in. And if we are being honest with ourselves for just one moment, we have to admit that maybe, just maybe, we are trusting more in our force than in our faith, more in our military than in our morality. You cannot survey the global map scattered with hundreds of American military bases and not ask whether this is still about protecting lives, or if it has slowly become about protecting influence, and if the strength of a nation is built only on its firepower and not on its principles, then how strong is it really? Because at some point, weapons need wisdom and boots need vision and plans need purpose, or all you are doing is spinning your wheels, burning fuel, protecting a version of security that is rooted in fear rather than trust. See, the truth is, you do not build peace with bigger armies, you build peace with bigger hearts. You do not keep nations together with muscle alone. You keep them together by standing for something that does not shift with the politics of the moment. And somewhere along the way we stopped leading with our values and started leading with our vehicles, with our carriers, our jets, our special forces, our battle groups. And in doing so we forgot that the world was never just asking us to be strong, it was asking us to be right now. Do not get me wrong, strength has its place. We live in a broken world, and there are real threats out there. And sometimes strength is necessary, but when strength becomes the only language we speak, we stop recognizing that other languages exist. We lose the ability to listen, to reason, to conscience, conviction. We stop looking people in the eye and start tracking them with satellites, and that changes us whether we realize it or not. I look at what we are building, and I wonder if we realize that someday all those bases, all that might, could still fail us if the core of who we are is not intact, because nations do not fall just when the enemy breaks through their defenses. They fall when people forget what those defenses were meant to protect, when security becomes a substitute for soul, when we get so busy preparing for war that we stop preparing for peace, we have created a world where presence is treated like assurance, where as long as we have troops stationed somewhere, that means we are doing our job. But do we think that having a flag posted in a corner of another country makes us righteous? Do we think that a base equals a bond? Because let me tell you, it does not. Relationships are not anchored in hard, where they are anchored in honor, and if we are not being honest about why we are where we are, then we are not being honorable at all. And here is where it gets urgent, because what happens when a generation grows up thinking that the only way to be safe is to be surrounded? What happens when our children believe that American identity is defined by where our weapons sit, and not where our moral compass points? What happens when our leaders forget that trust is earned, not enforced, and forget that influence is a gift, not a guarantee? This is bigger than geopolitics. This is spiritual. And I do not mean religious. I mean it touches the soul of a nation. It speaks to what we believe about justice and mercy and truth and courage. Have we outsourced those things to tanks and drones and bases? Have we pushed the hard work of character and community and diplomacy into the shadows because it demands more than budgets and battalions, because it requires humility instead of hegemony? I would ask this: does the world fear us, or does it admire us? Do other nations follow us because they see something bright, or because they see something big? Are we the force that holds the world together, or are we the weight that keeps others from rising? Nothing great lasts without soul, not an empire, not an economy, and certainly not a nation. And soul is not something you can airlift. Soul is something you build. The foundation of anything lasting is integrity. And if our foreign presence comes at the expense of self-reflection, then it will one day come at the expense of our future, because might without meaning is empty, and presence without purpose is dangerous, and in the end it will not be the strength of our weapons that protects us. It will be the strength of what we stand for, because a nation that forgets its soul will soon find itself defending something it no longer even understands.